This is the Oots family plot. Sheriff Oots is right behind me. This is his grave, William H. Oots. And he was our longest serving sheriff here in Edgefield. He was born in 1839. He served in the Confederacy. He was wounded at the Battle of Petersburg, took a mini ball in his leg. He suffered from that wound the rest of his life, but he did serve 25 years as our sheriff, and he died in service while he was in service. Natural causes, but he did die during service. And buried here are his wife Isabella, and a lot of his children are buried here. This is the grave of Francis Hugh Wardlaw. He was a very well-known lawyer here, attorney. He was also the chancellor in South Carolina, and his most famous thing he did was he drew up the Ordinance of Secession for South Carolina, and he died shortly thereafter. He died in May of 1861 after drawing it up in December of 1860.
His is pretty plain grave.
It is, very plain. Here's one of our 10 governors, Francis W. Pickens. He was an ambassador to Russia, and he also was one of our 2 Confederate governors. Both of the governors who served during the Confederacy were from Edgefield. But anyway, here's Francis Pickens right here. That's his grave right there with the laurel on it, meaning victory. And buried next to him is his daughter, one of his daughters. This is, first off, I'll introduce you to Lucy.
Oh, this is Lucy?
This is Lucy. This is Miss Lucy Pickens, Lucy Holcomb Pickens.
Okay.
She was born in Texas. She meets Francis, and he instantly falls in love with her because she's so beautiful. She agrees to marry him when he becomes the ambassador to Russia. And she goes with him to Russia, and she charms the whole Russian family, the royal family. She has her daughter Dushka, which means little darling in Russian. She has a really long name, but that's her nickname. And born over there in Russia. And when they come back home, when the war breaks out, she sells off a lot of the jewels that were given to her by the royal Russian family and outfits Holcomb's Legion. And she was so beautiful that she became known as the Queen of the Confederacy, and she's the only woman in America to have her face on money. She was on the $100 bill and the $1 Confederate bills. Who formed the leper colony in the South China Sea and was a missionary to China. And this stone is from that leper colony. It used to be bright white, like a moonstone, moon rock. But anyway, this was brought here and put here as a memorial to him. Okay, this is the grave of General Matthew Calverth Butler, who was one of our 4 brigadier generals buried here. He served as brigadier general during the Confederacy and during the Spanish-American War. He was also a senator from Edgefield, and was a lawyer, a statesman. He served 18 years in the U.S. Senate, in fact. And this is his picture. He lived right up on Columbia Road for a while in Edgefield. His home was known as East Hill. He was, during the war between the states, he had his foot shot off during, as a cannonball passed through his horse and took off his foot. That usually ended the career of a cavalryman. He was in charge of Butler's brigade, but he had a wooden foot made, and he went back and served the rest of the war. What's interesting is that he had his foot embalmed, and when he died, it was his request to be buried with his foot. So, Lucy Butler and his foot now rest together. But Lucy Butler was known as quite a ladies' man, and I actually have one lady who told me that her, I think it was her great-grandmother, was put in the insane asylum in Columbia because she was so in love with MC Butler, and she was a married woman, and her husband felt like it was more of a scandal for her to be loose on the streets, you know, wanting MC Butler than to be put in the asylum.
Oh my God. The weeping willow, people actually think it is a sign of grief and mourning, which it can be, but usually it's a sign of everlasting life. And you'll see them all through the cemetery. It was the most popular icon during the 19th century. It usually means everlasting life or eternal life. because no matter how much you try to cut down a weeping willow, it's going to try to come back, rejuvenate. So that's more of a symbol of that instead of a symbol of death and mourning. And that's the grave of Lily J. Bryan. You'll notice the lady here. When I first saw this, I thought she was a lady in mourning. She was weeping. If you notice, she's sitting in quiet repose. She has the weeping willow beside her, which is a symbol of resurrection. She's holding a cross. She's clinging to the cross. So she's showing piety and reverence and a belief in eternal life and in God and Jesus. So that's showing that right there. And I think that's just the most beautiful piece of iconology in here. I really love that piece. This is the grave of Colonel William Kane Maroney. William Maroney was born in 1818 in New Bordeaux, which was a French Huguenot settlement. He served in the Second Seminole War, served in the Mexican War with his brother John, and then he later served in the Confederacy. Between the wars, he was an attorney, a very prominent attorney. He was also one of the editors of the Edgefield Advertiser and owner of the Advertiser. When he went to serve in the war, he was an aide to Beauregard, and he found out that they needed troops, so he came back to Edgefield, formed the 19th South Carolina, and went back to fight, but his health broke, and he died in October of 1862. And you'll notice that the magnolia trees are just pushing up his grave and just destroying it. It's only a matter of time before this whole thing just collapses. And next to him is buried his wife, Emmy Butler. They were married in 1856. It was a short-lived marriage. She died a few years later in 1860. I like to show off her iconology. She has the broken harp or lyre, and you'll notice that the string is broken on the grave, and that's a symbol of a break between this life and the next.
Oh, really? I wouldn't have even noticed. I mean.
This is the grave of Dr. James Adams DeVore. Dr. DeVore served in the Confederacy, and he was a very interesting and eccentric character. I'm standing on the trap door to his vault. According to legend, Dr. DeVore is buried sitting in a chair behind glass. They could go down and see Dr. DeVore sitting behind glass in a chair. According to people who were growing up in the 1950s, they said that an individual was dared to go down there, and he saw it. But there was a preacher here who did not like people going down there, so he supposedly filled it in with all the dirt and debris. And then when the cross collapsed, it did whatever damage it's done, and we don't know. It's supposed to have an archway, and you go down into a tunnel, and he's supposed to be sitting right back in there behind glass in a chair. But we don't know what's happened. So if we can get back there, we're going to open it back up, and then we'll have it locked up, though, so that people can't just go down there. He died in 1895 during the height of the strange Victorian burial practices. So we're excited to find out. And this is our major project right now, is to get this done. This is Lieutenant Colonel Albert Bland. Albert Bland was a physician, a very well-known physician. When the war between the states breaks out, he goes and he fights in the 7th South Carolina. September 20th, 1863, he was mortally wounded at the Battle of Chickamauga and was killed. His wife, Rebecca Griffin, loved him dearly, and for the next 20 years she grieved and mourned for him. She was a beautiful woman, and she had many suitors after the war, but she would have nothing to do with him, and she dressed in all black for the rest of her life, mourning for her beloved husband. It was her request upon her death that his grave be opened and she be laid upon his bosom, which is exactly what they did, and all she asked for was a footstone at the end of his grave. Okay, so this is the grave of Edmund Bacon, Esquire, who died in 1826, and he was known as the great orator. He was very, very eloquent in his speeches. When he was 15 years old, he was going to Richmond Academy in Augusta, when George Washington came through in 1791. And he was chosen to speak in front of George Washington. And according to the story, George Washington was so moved, he shed a tear at his speech, and he sent Bacon a set of law books which are still supposed to be in the Bacon family today. Buried here is Whitfield Brooks, who fought in the War of 1812. His wife, Mary Parsons Carroll Brooks. and their sons are buried here with them. One son, Whitfield Butler, was killed in the Mexican War. Then they had two sons, John Hampden Brooks and another son who fought in the war between the states. But the most famous is, of course, Preston Brooks. Preston Brooks was very, very well known here in Edgefield, very famous. And he was served in the U.S. House of Representatives, dashingly good looking. And he was in Company D of the Palmetto Regiment during the Mexican War and served valiantly. But his claim to fame was the caning of Charles Sumner. Well, when the war between the states was starting to brew, when nullification was at its height in the 1850s, Charles Sumner of Massachusetts spoke out against South Carolina, and particularly against A.P. Butler of Edgefield. He was a cousin of Preston Brooks, and he was quite up in age. So he himself could not challenge Sumner to a duel. Preston Brooks took it upon himself to go into the U.S. Senate one day, and he whipped Charles Sumner unconscious with a cane. Now, when he was asked why, and he resigned from the House of Representatives immediately, but immediately he was reelected, and he was sent canes from all over South Carolina and other southern states saying, "Hit him again." But the reason that he caned Charles Sumner that way, instead of challenging him to a duel, when he was asked that question, he said, "Only men meet on the field of honor. I caned him like the dog he was." Unfortunately, he died before the war even began, but he is seen as one of the catalysts that brought on the war. Almost all the graves have some story to tell, whether it's through their icons or through their family name or just by the legacy they left behind.